Welcome to a deep dive.
Hey there.
Today, we're really plunging into a fascinating intellectual sparring match. It's quite something. We're cracking open a series of articles by Dr. Jorge Guerra Pires. He's a systems biologist.
Right.
And he's taken a really critical look at the public arguments of Professor John Lennox. You probably know him, the Oxford mathematician and Christian apologist.
Yeah, Lennox is a prominent figure. And what's interesting about these sources, these articles by Pires, is they give you this very specific critical viewpoint. It's coming directly from a practicing scientist.
Exactly. Someone in the field looking at how these science and religion debates play out.
Right, wading into that complex intersection.
So our mission here, for you listening, is to really understand Dr. Pires' critique from the inside. How does he see scientific ideas, especially systems biology, being used or maybe misused in these discussions?
And what does his analysis tell us about evaluating arguments, when they cross between different fields, like science, philosophy, theology?
We're going to unpack his points about complexity, logic, and why maybe knowing your specific field really matters here. This is basically your shortcut to the heart of this particular debate, as Pires sees it.
Okay, so let's set the scene first. How does Pires actually lay out Professor Lennox's approach? What's the starting point?
Well, according to Pires, Lennox definitely engages with modern science. He brings systems biology into the discussion.
And often focuses on biological complexity, right? That seems key.
That's the main example Pires uses Lennox's discussion of DNA. Pires describes Lennox using these really evocative terms like calling DNA linguistically complex.
Huh, like a language.
Yeah, or a 3.4 billion letter long word, or even a digital database.
Okay.
And the argument Pires outlines is that this sheer level of intricate complexity, well, Lennox argues it points strongly towards an intelligent source, a mind behind it all.
Right. Complexity equals design, essentially. That's the core idea Pires is attributing to him.
And Pires mentions specific things Lennox apparently says, like pointing out that we humans can't just build birds or create living cells from scratch.
Okay, yeah.
And Pires says Lennox uses this current inability, the fact that no human mind, let alone natural process, has been able to achieve this level of complexity yet, to suggest that, well, maybe something beyond nature must be involved.
Something supernatural. And Pires also notes that Lennox brings up Denis Noble, the systems biology pioneer.
He does, and according to Pires, Lennox sort of uses Noble's work to suggest that neo-Darwinism is, maybe inadequate.
Or needs replacement, even.
That's the picture Pires paints of Lennox's starting position, using complexity and critiques of existing biology.
Got it. So that's Lennox's view as seen by Pires. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because Pires isn't just reporting, he's a systems biologist himself.
Exactly. So he offers this direct counter-critique coming from inside that field.
And his main point, his central claim, it's pretty blunt. He sees Lennox's use of systems biology less as genuine engagement and more as a misuse of complexity.
Misuse?
Yeah, or like a philosophical repurposing of its terminology, stripped of its scientific context. Taking the words, but not the meaning, maybe.
Okay, that's a strong critique, but didn't you say there's some agreement?
Well, yeah, and this is nuanced. Pires agrees with Lennox and with Denis Noble that systems biology does challenge simple reductionism.
That old idea that you can understand a whole organism just by looking at its tiniest parts in isolation.
Right. Systems biology shows that interactions, networks, the whole system, it all matters profoundly. You can't just reduce it to genes alone, for example.
Okay, so they agree on that. Systems matter. But Pires draws a completely different conclusion.
Totally different. Pires argues that what systems biology actually reveals isn't the need for a designer, but the incredible power and sufficiency of networks themselves.
What sufficiency of networks?
Yeah.
What does that mean in practice?
He uses examples. Think about network motifs. These are like tiny recurring circuit patterns found in biological systems. Pires talks about the feed-forward loop, the FFL.
Okay, like a little building block in the network.
Exactly. And Pires explains how these simple-ish structures, when connected in networks, can give rise to really complex, seemingly designed functions like precise timing control for when genes switch on or off.
So the complexity comes out of the network connections?
Yes. He calls these emergent properties of interconnected systems. The system as a whole can do things the individual parts can't.
Right.
And Pires frames this really powerfully. He says it shows how Order can arise from interaction, not imposition, from bottom-up processes, not top-down design.
Ah, okay, so the order bubbles up from the system itself rather than being put in from outside.
That's his argument.
Yeah.
And it directly counters that complexity implies designer idea.
And what about Denis Noble? How does Pires see Lennox using his work?
Pires argues Lennox misreads Noble, or maybe selectively uses him. He agrees Noble critiques gene-centric reductionism.
Right, Noble emphasizes things like multi-level causation, how different biological levels influence each other, and physiological feedback loops.
But Pires stresses Noble does all this within a scientific framework.
Yeah.
He's trying to improve biological explanation, not replace it with theology.
Okay.
Pires actually says he went back and reread Noble's book, The Music of Life, and states he couldn't find any mentions of God in it.
So Pires sees Lennox leveraging Noble's critique of one aspect of biology reductionism to imply a failure of all natural explanations.
That's exactly Pires' interpretation. He thinks Lennox stretches Noble's point beyond its intended scientific scope.
And what about that earlier point about us not being able to build cells? How does Pires respond to that?
He points straight to the field of synthetic biology.
Ah, right. Which is closely related to systems biology.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And Pires describes it as this active, ongoing field that is literally working on creating artificial life, building cells from components.
So progress is being made.
Definitely. And Pires frames it as, just a matter of time that humans will create life from no life. He sees it as undermining Lennox's argument that our current inability implies something supernatural. The gap is closing, essentially.
Okay, so wrapping up Pires' view on the systems biology angle.
Yeah.
He basically sees it as a kind of
God of the gaps rebranded. That's his phrase.
meaning systems of biology is being presented as the new mystery, the new gap in knowledge where God is needed.
Yeah, exactly. Even though Pires describes systems biology itself as this rigorous computational data-rich framework,
Yeah.
which in his view actually makes divine intervention less necessary, not more, for explaining biology.
It provides natural explanations for complexity.
That's his point. So appealing to its complexity without engaging its explanatory power is, for Pires, misleading.
Okay, that's a really clear breakdown of the science critique. But Pires also looks at Lennox's arguments, right? The logic, the way he debates.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He zeroes in on the logical structure and some specific debate tactics Pires finds problematic. He highlights an exchange reportedly involving Richard Dawkins.
Okay.
Pires brings up a classic logical fallacy, the argument from personal incredulity,
Which is basically,
saying, I just can't believe X could happen naturally, therefore it must be Y, where Y is often God or intelligent design. It confuses your personal inability to imagine something with objective impossibility.
right, I can't see how, so it must be.
Exactly. And Pires claims Lennox uses this when talking about DNA's complexity. I find it impossible to believe leads to, therefore, God.
And what was the exchange with Dawkins that Pires highlights?
So according to Pires, Dawkins pointed out this fallacy during a debate. He said, essentially, just because you find it incredible doesn't make it untrue.
Makes sense. How did Lennox respond, according to Pires?
Pires quotes Lennox responding something like, well, you suffer from personal credulity, basically accusing Dawkins of being too willing to believe that mind could emerge naturally from matter.
How does Pires analyze that response?
Pires is quite scathing about it, actually. He calls it astonishingly weak, even a childish playground spat kind of comeback.
Ouch.
Yeah. He sees it not as a real counter-argument, but as a rhetorical retreat, a kind of false equivalence, and ultimately an evasion or a dodge of the original point about the fallacy.
Just turning the accusation back rather than addressing the logic?
That's how Pires interprets it. And he contrasts this sort of move with how science is supposed to work.
Which relies on
Models, evidence, and testability, according to Pires, not just personal belief or disbelief. He argues that invoking explanations like supernatural minds just adds layers of unobservable complexity and halts inquiry because you can't really test them scientifically.
It shuts down the investigation.
That's the concern Pires raises. Now, there's another tactic Pires analyzes.
Okay.
It's Lennox's use of historical examples. Pires mentions Lennox linking figures like Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao, all associated with atrocities to atheism, seemingly as an argument against atheism itself.
The atheist regimes were terrible, therefore atheism is dangerous as line of argument.
Right. And it's really crucial here to understand Pires' critique. He's not making a historical judgment himself, but analyzing Lennox's use of this connection.
Okay, what's Pires' take on that tactic?
Pires sees it as an attempt to paint atheism in a negative light, while, in his view, conveniently ignoring problematic historical aspects associated with Christianity.
A sort of selective use of history.
That's Pires' perspective. He critiques it as a logical fallacy. Specifically, correlation implies causation, assuming atheism caused the atrocities just because the leaders were atheists. He labels the tactic itself as propaganda or maybe even Cold War rhetoric.
So again, focusing on the structure and intent of the argument, not necessarily debating the history itself in this context.
Exactly. Pires is looking at the rhetorical strategy, and his overall conclusion on this front is that Lennox uses rhetorical flourishes and authority to mask the absence of scientific rigor. Pires characterizes this whole pattern as apologetics in rhetorical disguise, or even possibly motivated cognition, where the thinking process itself is sort of skewed towards defending a pre-existing belief, especially when it's challenged intellectually.
So it's not just what Lennox says, but Pires is suggesting there's something about how he approaches these diverse topics, maybe influenced by his background?
That's exactly where Pires goes next. He brings in Lennox's background as a pure mathematician.
Okay, how does that connect?
Well, Pires draws this pretty sharp contrast between pure mathematics and biology.
How does he describe them?
He calls pure math a dry science, highly abstract, focused on internal consistency, maybe a bit insulated from messy reality.
Logical perfection is the goal.
Right, whereas biology, Pires calls a wet science. It's inherently messy, empirical, totally driven by experimental data and observation of the complex, often unpredictable real world.
You can't just reason your way to how a cell works, you have to look.
Exactly. A biologist, Pires implies, is constantly bumping up against messy data that might contradict a neat theory. An abstract mathematician, less so.
And Pires' point, linking this back to Lennox, is...
It's pretty crucial.
Yeah.
He argues that being brilliant in abstract mathematics, which Lennox undoubtedly is, doesn't automatically grant you the same level of authority or, importantly, methodological rigor when you step into empirical fields like biology, or history, or cosmology, or even philosophy of science.
Different fields require different ways of knowing, different standards of evidence.
Precisely. Pires has this pointed phrase: mathematical intelligence is not a substitute for epistemological discipline. Epistemology being, the study of how we know what we know. Different fields have different epistemologies.
That makes sense. It's not just about being smart. It's about using the right tools for the job.
That seems to be Pires' argument. He also touches on Lennox's appreciation for the beauty of the Bible.
Okay.
Pires sees this potentially as what he calls a category error. He thinks Lennox might be conflating two different kinds of beauty.
What's the difference he sees?
Pires suggests the beauty of mathematics comes from its rigorous logic, empirical grounding sometimes, and its universal consistency. For Pires, that kind of beauty reveals something true about reality.
Okay, a beauty based on structure and truth.
Whereas Pires argues the Bible's beauty might be more like superficial charm, stemming from ancient ignorance, cultural biases, poetic license. He suggests it doesn't reveal reality in the same verifiable way that science or math does. So appreciating both is fine, but calling them the same kind of beautiful, truth-revealing thing is the error in Pires' view.
Interesting distinction. A bit provocative.
Definitely. And Pires uses this quote, often attributed to Einstein, "Since the mathematicians have invaded the theory of relativity, I do not understand it myself anymore."
Right.
Pires uses it to illustrate a potential danger when the high-level abstraction, typical of pure math, gets applied too rigidly in fields that rely more on intuition or empirical grounding. He suggests this might echo Lennox's approach outside of mathematics.
Like maybe oversimplifying or missing the nuances of a field like biology because you're applying a purely abstract framework.
That's the potential pitfall Pires seems to be pointing towards. And this all circles back to a concern Pires has about Lennox's public influence.
His platform and his credentials.
Exactly. His academic prestige, Oxford professor. Pires worries that this prestige acts as leverage, lending an authority that might make people accept arguments that Pires believes would otherwise buckle under scrutiny if judged purely on their scientific or logical merit.
So the credentials might overshadow the content?
That's the danger Pires flags. He uses some pretty stark terms for it, calling it PR for faith, or maybe most memorably, apologetics in a lab coat.
Wow. That phrase really paints a picture. The idea that it looks like science on the outside, but it's serving a different purpose on the inside.
That's precisely the image Pires evokes. It suggests the appearance of scientific engagement without the underlying substance from his critical perspective.
Okay, so let's try to pull all these threads together. What's the overarching synthesis of Dr. Pires' critique of John Lennox based on these articles?
I think the core assertion running through everything Pires writes here is that Lennox's public engagement with science and logic isn't primarily a neutral, open-ended inquiry into truth.
But more of a defensive strategy.
Yes, a defensive strategy rooted in Christian apologetics. That's Pires' fundamental claim about the motivation he perceives.
And this strategy, according to Pires, employs specific methods we've discussed.
Right. He argues it involves misrepresenting scientific fields, particularly systems biology, by taking terms out of context.
Potentially misunderstanding or misusing the work of key figures like Denis Noble.
Employing logical fallacies, like the argument from personal incredulity he highlights.
Using rhetorical tactics Pires finds questionable, like that historical linking argument.
And perhaps underlying some of this, being influenced by an over-reliance on abstract mathematical thinking that might not translate well to the messy empirical realities of fields like biology.
And Pires consistently contrasts this with his own field's findings.
Absolutely. He keeps returning to the idea that systems biology, properly understood, points towards emergent order, not divine design.
So his bottom line is really a warning.
Yeah, it seems to be a warning against using the language and prestige of science without genuinely engaging with its empirical methods, its findings, and its specific ways of knowing. Pires views that approach as ultimately misleading.
Okay. We've really covered a lot of ground there. We've taken a deep dive specifically into Dr. Jorge Guerra Pires' critical perspective on Professor John Lennox.
Focusing on how Pires sees Lennox using science like systems biology and complexity, and also logic and rhetoric in his public arguments.
We've unpacked Pires' key points about things like domain expertise, his identification of logical fallacies, and that really interesting intersection of academic prestige and public discourse he flags.
And it's worth stressing again, right, this deep dive was into one specific critique. This is Pires' analysis, offering you his perspective as a systems biologist looking at these arguments. It's not the only view out there, of course.
Absolutely. Which leads to a final thought, really, for you listening. When you encounter arguments out there, and you will, that blend science, philosophy, maybe faith, how do you navigate that?
How do you distinguish between what might be genuine, insightful, interdisciplinary work and what Dr. Pires colorfully calls apologetics in a lab coat?
Yeah, how do you make sure that you are evaluating the actual content of the argument, the evidence, the logic itself?
And not just being swayed by, say, the impressive credentials or the perceived authority of the person making the case.
What specific questions should you be asking yourself when you hear these kinds of complex claims? Something to think about.